Chapter 11. Sheep devour people. Ghost ships, green cheese, and get off my land. In May 1349, a ship carrying sacks of wool ran aground off the coast of Norway. When curious locals boarded the stricken vessel, they found, to their horror, that the entire crew was dead. Having set off from London, bound for Bergen, one by one the sailors had died in feverish, blistered agony. Little did the Norwegian villagers know that as soon as they had boarded the shipwreck, their dreadful fate had also been sealed. The Black Death swept across Europe, decimating towns and villages in its wake, helped in no small measure by the merchant ships that carried raw wool, finished cloth, and the deadly bacterium Yersinia pestis back and forward between Europe's busiest ports. By the time the plague had exhausted its mission, it had killed around half Europe's population. And in the 100 or so years that followed the Black Death, sheep became even more important to the rural economy of England. The effects of the plague had been devastating, wiping out entire communities. And while few places were left untouched by its deadly grip, certain areas suffered particularly catastrophic declines in population, especially those areas that had frequent contact with the continent, such as East Anglia. The town of Great Yarmouth in Norfolk, for example, lost over 7,000 of its 9,000 or so inhabitants in 1 year alone. Romney Marsh, further south, was also badly hit. Smugglers may have brought the disease to this quiet corner of southeast England. Out went the raw wool to France, and along with their contraband, in came the rats and the plague. Some of the hamlets and villages on the Romney Marsh were simply deserted or decimated, never to be reoccupied. In Romney Marsh and across much of Britain, the population drop caused by the Black Death meant that there often simply weren't enough people left behind to cultivate the land. The lucky few who did survive also found they could command higher wages. Government and great landowners started to become increasingly concerned about the growing power of the rural workforce. Poor folk were clearly getting ideas above their station. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 attempted to fix wages at their 1345 level. The French government followed suit with similar legislation only a few years later. The idea that peasants could hold any power over the privileged turned traditional notions on their head, unsettling the upper strata of 14th century society. John Gower, friend of Chaucer, reminisced about the good old days before social boundaries were so roundly trampled. The labourers of olden times were not accustomed to eat wheat bread. Their bread was made of brands and of other corn, and their drink was water. Then cheese and milk were as a feast to them. Rarely had they any other feast than this. Their clothing was plain grey. Then was the world of such folk ordered in its estate. One of the most bizarre outcomes of this period was the strengthening of sumptuary laws, rules and regulations designed to restrict what people bought and wore. The idea was clear. What you consumed marked out your social rank. Clothing in particular showed status. How confusing, argued the medieval elite, to have newly moneyed lower classes wearing luxurious upper-class garments. The statute concerning diet and apparel, introduced in England in 1363, is almost hysterical in its desire to keep people in their socially defined boxes. While lords with lands worth over £1,000, just under £1 million in today's money, could wear pretty much what they liked, every other stratum of society was subject to restrictions based on wealth. With every drop in personal riches, the permitted clothes became dowdier. For most people, furs and precious fabrics were banned. No weasel fur, ermine, clothing decorated with precious stones, no cloth of gold, no silk, and so on. At the bottom of the heap, carters, ploughmen, drivers of the plough, oxherds, cowherds, shepherds, and all other people owning less than 40 shillings of goods and chattels shall only wear blanket and russet worth no more than 12pence, and girdles of linen according to their estate. Russet was a coarse, cheap, brown-grey woolen cloth. Wearing it would instantly mark you out as poor, but for some it became a badge of piety. Priests belonging to mendicant orders such as the Franciscans would wear russet as a sign of their asceticism. Some 300 years later, during the English Civil War, Oliver Cromwell, Parliamentary General and future Lord Protector of England, remarked pointedly in a letter to Sir William Spring, "I had rather have a plain russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for and loves what he knows, than that you call a gentleman and is nothing else." The marked reduction of the population also permanently changed the landscape of Britain. Sheep farming was one of the only types of agriculture that didn't need much labour. One shepherd could tend to vast areas of pasture. Numbers of sheep increased dramatically. On the Bishop of Winchester's estate, for example, there were 22,500 sheep in 1348. By the mid-1350s, it had increased to 30,000 and would peak at nearly 35,000 by 1369. But the biggest change in both the appearance and economics of the English landscape came about as a result of enclosure. Since the Roman invasion, the English countryside had been enthusiastically farmed in places. By the time of the Domesday Book, around 8 million acres of land were tilled, unlike the rest of northwest Europe, where huge areas of wilderness remained intact. Much of central and southern England was occupied, and it was difficult to travel for more than half a day without making human contact. Arable farming was particularly important, but few parcels of land were owned outright by anyone but the king. The king gave certain rights to local lords, who then rented out land to tenants. In return for rent and labour, the tenant had legal rights to farm the land and access to common areas such as woodland where he could exercise certain rights. These common rights might include the right to fish, cut turf for fuel, take fallen wood for burning, extract walling stone or lime for building, turn pigs out to pannage, woodland floor grazing, and graze livestock, including sheep, on common pasture land. The ancient open field system operated on a basis of communal use. Each lord had an area of land called a manor, which was divided into fields and then into narrow strips of land. Each tenant would have a mixture of strips, some on good land, some of poor land, so that, in an ideal world, each tenant had roughly the same amount of cultivatable land. The fields and strips had little or nothing by way of boundaries, no walls, ditches or high hedges, and were looked after by families or individuals. One strip might be used to grow wheat, another to grow hay for winter feed, and another for grazing. For centuries, this system of shared fields persisted. Tenants would hope to grow enough to subsist, and, in a good year, exchange any surplus for goods or money. Villagers would come together to plough, harvest, and settle any disputes or areas of common interest. Without romanticising what would have been a tough, precarious existence as a small-scale farmer, life under the open field system was at least relatively self-sufficient and egalitarian. With the population in tatters after the Black Death, wages rising and the demand for British wool showing few signs of letting up, great landlords and sometimes groups of farmers began enclosing parcels of land to create large fields for sheep grazing. Boundaries went up, and rights that had been exercised for hundreds of years were swept away by the effective privatisation of land. The process was piecemeal and informal at first, and sometimes even carried out with the cooperation of a group of farming tenants, but a notion had been set in place that was to permanently alter how people viewed the land. Access became a privilege, not a right. The first onslaught of enclosure came between the 14th and 17th centuries, leaving thousands of people dispossessed. While some peasants sought redress in the courts, many others felt compelled to take direct action. Combined with the effects of decades of high taxes, inflation, famine, plague, war, and a belief that wealth inequality was against God's teachings, there were a number of ill-fated popular uprisings, including Wat Tyler's Peasants' Revolt of 1381, Jack Cade's Rebellion of 1450, and Kett's Rebellion of 1549. Many of the names of those involved in these uprisings are still celebrated as radical heroes today, but we rarely hear of John Reynolds, hero of the Midland Revolt of 1607. The story begins, as all good ones do, with a pantomime villain. Sir Thomas Tresham was a greedy landlord, widely hated for rampant acts of enclosure across the entire parish. Ignoring pleas and even a legal ruling against him, Tresham carried on annexing land, throwing off farmers and tenants, and replacing them with sheep. By the spring of 1607, Thomas Tresham was dead, as was his son Francis, who was executed for his role in the Gunpowder Plot. But the family's penchant for enclosure continued unabated, and the people of Northamptonshire had had enough. Their hero came in the unlikely form of John Reynolds, an uneducated tinker with an unshakable belief that God was on his side. On his belt he wore a leather pouch, the mysterious contents of which were secret, but he claimed would protect his followers from harm and secure a victory. Trouble broke out in Rushton in April, and the following month spread to the neighbouring counties of Leicestershire and Warwickshire. In Coatsbatch in Leicestershire, as many as 5,000 people are thought to have joined Reynolds, or Captain Pouch, as he became known, pulling down fences, filling in ditches, and scrubbing up hedgerows in protest. Despite their enthusiasm, the rebellion was quickly quashed by the King's militia, and Captain Pouch arrested. He was charged and sentenced to the punishment reserved especially for traitors, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. On his death, the leather pouch was opened. The secret contents, which had galvanised the entire rebellion, turned out to be just a lump of old mouldy cheese. The effects of enclosure on the poor were often catastrophic. Few were compensated for their loss of access to common land, and the traditional peasantry were replaced by an agricultural proletariat dependent on waged labour. In the old open field system, tenants remained, for good or ill, the paternalistic responsibility of the lord of the manor. Not only did it make sound economic sense for him to keep his tenants alive and relatively healthy, as his wealth came from their efforts, but it also afforded him the social cachet of the benevolent landlord. The church had also, until then, seen it as their moral duty to care for the poor and oppressed, the widows, orphans, infirm and elderly. Monasteries and church hospitals routinely gave alms to the needy, whether able-bodied or not. Poverty wasn't seen as a moral failing. It was simply the result of unfortunate circumstances, and certainly not something that could be eradicated by punishment. The toxic combination of the enclosures, the plague, the demise of the monasteries, and a rising landless population led to a new class of poor, the wandering ones, people who went from parish to parish, town to village, village to town, searching desperately for work. What was different, however, was how the government planned to deal with them. In the past, begging was regarded as acceptable. It was one of the only legitimate ways the unemployed poor could survive. Indeed, those at the time who were familiar with the teachings of the Bible would have known that the destitute were to be protected. The Gospel, according to Luke, quoted Jesus as saying to his disciples, "Blessed be ye poor, for yours is the kingdom of God," while Isaiah 10, 1-2 stated, "Woe to the legislators of infamous laws, to those who issue tyrannical decrees, refuse justice to the unfortunate, and cheat the poor among my people of their rights, who make widows their prey and rob the orphan." The Statute of Labourers, which had capped workers' wages after the Black Death, however, provided explicit instructions about what to do with the able-bodied beggars. They were to be seized and put to work. This was the first time public policy had divided the poor into the deserving and undeserving, a notion that still permeates social policy today. Subsequent Acts of Parliament concerned with poor relief built on this notion of punishing the idle, those beggars and vagabonds who, in society's eyes, chose not to work. A raft of vagrancy acts between 1495 and 1597 laid out a set of brutal disincentives against begging or vagrancy. The 1531 Vagabonds Act, for example, made it clear who could do what. Only the aged and impotent could beg, and even then they needed a letter of authorisation to do so and could only beg in a certain parish or area. Those found begging outside their zone or without an official letter faced the stocks and the humiliation of being stripped naked from the middle upwards and whipped. And that was if you were a legitimate beggar. Any man, woman or child, being in whole and mighty in body and able to labour, who was caught begging, faced harsh treatment from the local justice of the peace. every such justice, etc., by the discretions, shall cause every such idle person to be had to the next market town, or to other place most convenient, and there be tied to the end of a cart, naked, and beaten with whips throughout the same town or other place, till his body be bloody by reason of such whipping. And after such punishment he shall be enjoined upon his oath to return forthwith the next straight way to the place where he was born, or where he last dwelled the space of 3 years, and there put himself to labour like as a true man oweth to do. Under the subsequent 1547 Vagrancy Act, passed by Edward VI, able-bodied beggars were branded with the letter V and legally enslaved for 2 years. Their masters were required to feed them bread and water, but had the freedom to beat, whip or chain their charges as they saw fit. Child vagrants, without the consent of their parents, were also bought and sold into service and held until adulthood. While the slavery element of the 1547 Act made it unpopular with the general population, and it was repealed in 1550, a subsequent 1572 Act replaced indenture with state-sanctioned torture. All vagabonds to be grievously whipped and burned through the gristle of the right ear with a hot iron an inch in diameter. These were no idle threats. Beggars would be punished. In 1630, for example, the poet John Taylor counted 60 whipping posts, known locally as posts of reformation, on London's streets alone. The brutality of the early poor relief system and the eviction of peasant farmers from the land for sheep didn't go unnoticed by contemporary writers and commentators. Thomas More's Utopia, published more than 500 years ago in 1516, was astonishingly critical for its time. More saw the mass poverty created by the enclosures and the greed of the wealthy as a direct affront to Christian principles. Your sheep that were wont to be so meek and tame, and so small eaters, now become so great devourers and so wild that they eat up and swallow down the very men themselves. They consume, destroy and devour whole fields, houses and cities. It's radical stuff, not least because it aims its fire directly at those at the very highest levels of society who live, Moore complains, like parasites on the labour of others. It cannot be right, he argues, that one insatiable glutton and accursed plague of his native land may join field to field and surround many thousand acres with one fence. Few areas of the country escape the effects of the land grab. Shakespeare even found himself embroiled in an enclosure scandal. The Bard and his cousin Thomas Green were modest landowners in Stratford, earning tithe income from their fields. Two local wealthy men, John Combe and Arthur Mannering, attempted to enclose land that included Shakespeare and Green's plots. Shakespeare and Green would be compensated, insisted the proposers of the scheme, but both the Stratford Corporation and Green objected, worried the enclosures would add to growing local unemployment and push up grain prices. Although the enclosures initially went ahead, to the community's despair, the scheme eventually faltered and was more or less abandoned. And despite the fact that Shakespeare had in many ways championed the dispossessed and landless in plays such as King Lear, when push came to shove, he chose to protect his own interests. Shakespeare, unbeknown to Green, had made a private pact with Mannering that ensured he wouldn't lose out financially, whatever the outcome. Few agree on the long-term effects of enclosures. For some, they represent a national trauma, a key moment when a large swathe of society became permanently dispossessed or, as the historian E.P. Thompson argued, a plain enough case of class robbery. Meticulous manorial records from the 15th and 16th centuries detail, with painstaking clarity, the rising number of sheep kept by landowners. But few accounts give any qualitative detail about the human suffering that must have accompanied these changes. As one historian notes, if a village was already small and poorly located, and if a local landlord was sufficiently determined and aggressive, enclosure could result in the extinction of the community. For other social commentators, enclosures represent a necessary step in the development of agriculture, one that spelled an end to the grinding poverty and uncertainty of subsistence farming. Without doubt, enclosures made land more productive, allowed the population of Britain to increase, and set the foundations for the Industrial Revolution, but at an enormous human cost. Whichever view you hold, by the 19th century there was little unenclosed land left, and what remained was largely rough mountain pasture, forest, and village greens. Today, the legacy of sheep enclosure lives on. Half of England is owned by just 25,000 landowners, less than 1% of its population. The Highland clearances of the late 18th and early 19th centuries constitute one of the darkest episodes in the history of enclosure. By the middle of the 18th century, the urge to enclose English land for sheep grazing was ebbing away. Much of the land had already been fenced off, and many of those displaced by its effects had drifted towards the towns and cities in search of factory work. The population was also rising rapidly, requiring more land for food production. Wool was still big business, but the growth of the cotton industry, fed by cheap imports from India and the slave plantations of the United States, was beginning to challenge wool's dominance of the market. Greedy eyes turned towards the Scottish Highlands. The Act of Union of 1707 had merged England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain. Scotland's extensive mountainous pastures had been occupied by Highland clans for centuries. But this proved little obstacle to those landowners and businessmen eager to replace people with sheep. There was also a political motive. The British establishment were keen to cleanse Scotland of the clans who had resisted the Union and who had supported the Jacobite revolts of 1715 and 1745-6, which had attempted to restore the Stuart dynasty in place of Britain's new Hanoverian monarchy. In a century-long process that has become known as the clearances, tens of thousands of Highlanders, men, women and children, were thrown off their traditional holdings, often violently, to make way for livestock. At first, many families were relocated to barren land by the sea, where they were expected to make a living from fishing, quarrying or harvesting seaweed for the soap and glass-making industries. In 1793, for example, the inhabitants of 3 inland valleys in Caithness were sent to Bad Bay, a remote and inhospitable scrap of land perched on top of a steep cliff on the county's southeastern coast. The women were expected to make cloth, the men to fish for herring, and each family was promised a small plot to tend. In reality, conditions were impossible. People were forced to clear their own plots and build houses from the stones and rocks lying around. Such was the ferocity of the weather. Reports from the time talk of livestock and children having to be tethered to posts to stop them being blown into the sea. Few Highlanders left willingly. Many were literally burnt out of house and home. Some even perished in the flames. In his book, The Highland Clearances, 1963, John Preble collected some of the first-hand accounts of the trauma inflicted on locals.
Betsy Mackay was 16 and she lived at the river's edge by Scale. Our family was very reluctant to leave, she remembered, and stayed for some time, but the burning party came round and set fire to our house at both ends, reducing to ashes whatever remained within the walls. The people had to escape for their lives, some of them losing all their clothes except what they had on their backs. The people were told they could go where they liked, provided they did not encumber the land that was by rights their own.
In another account, Grace MacDonald, then 19, shelters on a hill, watching her township burn.
Grace waited there a day and a night, watching Sellers' men sporting about the flames. When a terrified cat sprang from a burning house, it was seized and thrown back again, until it died there.
There was no mercy or pity shown to young or old, said Grace MacDonald. All had to clear away, and those who could not get their effects removed in time had it burnt before their eyes.
Some landlords offered assisted emigration for the Highlanders, paying the passage for families to be shipped off to America and later on Australia. In 1826, the Inner Hebridean Isle of Roome was cleared of its 300 inhabitants, who were packed off to Nova Scotia. While the owner of Roome had paid £5 for each passenger to be transported, he clearly knew he was getting a bargain. The entire community only paid £300 in annual rent, while the single sheep farmer who remained on the island with his 8,000 sheep was charged £900 a year. Roum had been occupied for thousands of years, since 7500 BC, and yet in the space of just 1 year it had all but been emptied. On leaving his ancestral land, a shepherd of Roum, John McMaster, recalled, "The wild outcries of the men and the heartbreaking wails of the women and children, filling all the air between the mountainous shores," as the people were chased onto the ships for Nova Scotia, at the beginning of winter too. The ships were, with dreadful irony, called the Dove of Harmony and the Highland Lad. On at least one occasion, tenants were even handcuffed and physically forced aboard awaiting ships. In 1851, 1,500 inhabitants of Barra, in the Outer Hebrides, were duped into attending a compulsory meeting about land rents. Instead, the Barra people were overpowered and forced to board ships waiting to take them to Canada. As people were frog-marched on board, those that resisted were handcuffed. Any that broke free and made a run for it were chased down by dogs and captured. Only a few Barra residents escaped the clutches of the pursuing estate officers by fleeing to the hills, including 2 young girls, aged 12 and 14. Their parents, along with the rest of the islanders, set sail without them. When the ships finally reached Atlantic shores, life was no better. One Ontario newspaper, the Dundas Warder, reported in the same year, "We have been pained beyond measure for some time past to witness in our streets so many unfortunate Highland emigrants, apparently destitute of any means of subsistence, and many of them sick from want and other attendant causes." For a while, the new Highland sheep farms were a success. Up until the early 1870s, pretty much every area of the British agricultural sector was booming, or as one commentator put it, everything appeared to be going the British farmer's way. Sheep farming was doing particularly well. Wool prices almost doubled between the 1850s and 1860s, largely thanks to a cotton famine brought on by the economic and social disruption of the American Civil War. It was, according to one Highland land agent, a halcyon period when landlords and sheep farmers alike waxed fat and prosperous. It wasn't to last. At the end of the 19th century, the Highland sheep industry was to be decimated by a toxic mix of greed, bad luck, and foreign competition. Putting short-term profit before long-term sustainability, many sheep estates were overstocked. The land simply couldn't cope. The fertility of hill pastureland plummeted, and while some farmers reduced the numbers of sheep they kept, others simply pressed ahead, maintaining stocks at previous levels. With not enough grass to eat, the sheep failed to thrive, declined in quality, and became much more susceptible to disease. The weather also didn't help. During the 1870s and 1880s, a series of brutal winters hit the Highlands. During the worst of these, in 1879-80, some areas of Scotland saw protracted and heavy snowfall for 3 solid months, leaving sheep farmers hand-feeding their stock and losing many to the drifts. The real blow, however, came from America, Australia, and New Zealand. These newly settled lands had embraced large-scale agricultural production, and this, combined with rapid improvements in long-distance shipping, helped them to aggressively undercut British prices. Between the 1850s and the 1880s, wool imports had increased 5-fold. By the mid-1890s, 70% of all the wool being used in Great Britain came from overseas. In the 1880s, a folklorist named Alexander Mackenzie published a book in which he claimed to have collected the prophecies of the Brahman seer. Doubts have been raised as to whether the Brahman seer ever existed, and some claim he is an invention of Mackenzie's. Whatever the truth of the matter, his predictions make for uncanny reading.
"The day will come when sheep shall become so numerous that the bleating of the one shall be heard by the other from Conchra in Lochalsh to Bundaloch in Kintail. They shall be at their height in price, and henceforth will go back and deteriorate, until they disappear altogether. The ancient proprietors of the soil shall give place to strange merchant proprietors, and the whole Highlands will become one huge deer forest. The whole country will be so utterly desolated and depopulated that the crow of a cock shall not be heard north of Drumachdair."
Meanwhile, over in America, another traditional group of sheep farmers was also being displaced. The churro breed of sheep came to southwestern America with the Spanish conquistadors in the early 1500s. Within 100 years, the breed had been embraced by the indigenous Navajo, who loved its hardiness and adaptability to the arid native lands of New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah. The Navajo, who call themselves Diné or the people, prize the churro for their lean meat and low maintenance, but also their wool, which had long, lustrous fibres perfectly suited to hand spinning and weaving. The fleece was also naturally low in lanolin, making it easy to wash in an environment where every drop of water was precious. The indigenous people quickly became expert wool crafters, turning the churro fibre into coveted rugs, saddle blankets, coats, and other clothes. Soon the sustenance, success, and spirituality of the Navajo people became intertwined with the churro sheep, which they believed to be a gift from the gods. In 1863, however, the Navajo were declared enemies of the state. The U.S. military, led by frontiersman Kit Carson, was sent to suppress the Navajo with strict instructions to destroy their crops, orchards, and flocks. After slaughtering countless sheep, the U.S. Army then forced 9,000 Navajo to walk from their homeland to an internment camp 300 miles, 480 kilometers away. Scores of men, women, and children died on what has become known as the Long Walk. Those Navajos that evaded capture went into hiding with the remnants of their flocks, and over the next few decades of careful management were able to rebuild churro numbers along with other breeds of sheep. By the end of the 1920s, the Navajo people, who had been allowed to return to their ancestral lands, owned nearly 500,000 sheep. The good times weren't to last. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, the US government came calling again. Congress believed the Navajo had too many sheep on their land and enforced a mandatory stock reduction. Over the next decade, nearly half of the Navajo flock was slaughtered, bringing the indigenous economy to its knees and leaving the churro on the verge of extinction. The mass butchery of flocks traumatized the Navajo, who continue to recite stories of federal agents shooting sheep in their pens or chasing churro off cliff edges. Piles of 70-year-old sheep bones still litter many of the reservations. The story doesn't have an entirely unhappy ending, however. In the early 1970s, a Utah professor began the Navajo Sheep Project. His plan was to build up numbers from the handful of sheep that survived. Today, there are several thousand churros, but the sheep and Navajo who farm them face a different challenge. Thanks to climate change and the constant threat of droughts faced by many regions of southwestern America, a native way of life sits in the balance. Chapter 12. Spinning a Yarn. Fishermen's jumpers, men in tights, and a famous execution. During the long reign of Elizabeth I, the Channel Island of Guernsey exported a staggering number of hand-knitted woolen stockings. Islanders, often women and children working from home, were commissioned by middlemen to mass-produce fine knitted hosiery for an eager European market, including the English royal household. Both men and women clamoured to wear knitted tights. Most popular of all were canyons, or bas à canon. In Guernsey, canyons were called bas de canon, according to letters sent between Matthew and Michael de Saumarez in the 1600s. Source www.museums.gov.gg. Manly pull-ups worn with knee-length breeches and decorated with lace and ribbon. Queen Elizabeth paid 20 shillings for Guernsey wool stockings embellished with silk, the equivalent of 20 days' wages for a skilled tradesman. Mary, Queen of Scots, wouldn't be seen dead in anything else. She insisted on a pair of white Guernsey knitted stockings for the day of her execution. The Channel Islands were particularly well placed for exporting knitted goods. During the 1400s, Guernsey merchants had clubbed together to pay for a local militia to help resist French invasion. The Royal Guernsey Militia is thought to be one of the oldest British regiments. Guernsey, throughout its history, was under constant threat of invasion. In 1203, King John ordered that the elite of the island should provide sufficiency of men and money to defend the island from the enemy. Over the following centuries, Guernsey was subject to frequent raids, mostly by the French, but the island remained loyal to the British Crown. To show its gratitude, the Crown often waived taxes and custom duties on trade. In return, the merchants asked the king to issue a royal grant enabling islanders to import English wool at advantageous rates. Over the next few centuries, the Channel Islands also found themselves in the middle of an extensive trade network that stretched between Europe and newly established far-flung colonies such as Newfoundland. Warm woolen clothes were needed for the crews of privateering galleons, as well as an ever-expanding number of naval seamen and fishermen, all of whom undertook long, arduous sea journeys. By the mid-19th century, the blue Guernsey jumper had become a staple item of clothing for men in the fishing industry across Britain. In many places, such as Cornwall and Yorkshire, the Guernsey name mutated into the Gansey, but the design remained similar from region to region. It's knitted in the round, like a big tube without seams, making it possible to unravel sections and re-knit them, or recycle the wool if the jumper is beyond repair. The front and back is identical, so it can be worn back to front if a patch wears thin. It's also said that fishermen could wipe their hands on the jumpers and simply turn them around. Gussets under the arm stop the sweater from being strained when a fisherman is pulling hard to land a catch, and both the body and sleeves are knitted slightly short to stop them getting caught in the ropes or netting. The knitters used wool that was traditionally unwashed. Leaving the lanolin in the wool helped keep it waterproof for the men at sea. The fact that Guernseys are traditionally blue was down to a peculiarity of natural dyeing. Woad, a popular medieval dye, was one of the only ones that didn't require a fleece to be scoured first. This meant the yarn could take the blue colour without losing any of its natural water-resistant qualities. One of the defining features of the Guernsey or Gansey is the pattern, sometimes applied to the whole sweater, but more often kept to the chest and arms. The designs are based around familiar fishing imagery: ropes, cables, herringbones, netting, ladders, chains, and often particular to a parish or region. In England's northeast, for example, traditional fishing communities such as Robin Hood's Bay, Flamborough, Filey, Staithes, Scarborough and Whitby may share the same small stretch of coastline, but each community's Gansey has its own distinct, unmistakable pattern written into the fabric. Craft and hyperlocality often go hand in hand, families passing tweaks and idiosyncratic patterns of making down from generation to generation. There's sometimes no practical reason, just the pleasure of creating a signature, telltale piece. For fishing communities, the distinctiveness of a woolen sweater may have helped identify a body should an unfortunate fisherman fall victim to the sea. It's an idea that folklore enthusiasts love to repeat. Nothing grips the attention like a gruesome tale of a body washed up on a beach. But textile historians are cautious. Patterns on fishermen's jumpers were also passed between places, often as a result of herring girls, who would follow the seasonal migration of herring fleets around the country, knitting in their quieter moments and sharing patterns with other local women. Folklore has a way of becoming fact if repeated often enough, as is the case with another famous fishing jumper, the Arran. The Irish poet Seamus Heaney once described the Arran Islands across the mouth of Galway Bay in Ireland as 3 stepping stones out of Europe, anchored like holes at the dim horizon. Rocky, remote and startlingly beautiful, the islands give their name to Arran sweaters. Those chunky limestone white cable knits that have become a recognised symbol of Irish authenticity and kinship. Tourist shops will tell you that the sweaters contain special patterns or stitches that are unique to ancient families or clans, dating back hundreds of years. People, especially those with Irish ancestry, travel far and wide to purchase and wear a slice of their Celtic heritage. And yet, for the most part, this idea of clan patterns is pure fiction. There's been plenty of academic wrangling over the authenticity of Arran knitwear. What emerges is as much a story about migrant narratives as the history of knitting patterns. It all starts with a tale not dissimilar to the Guernsey or Gansey sweater. The basic narrative goes like this. A fisherman goes out onto the dangerous Atlantic Ocean wearing a jumper knitted by his female relations. Trying to earn a living, he is lost at sea. His battered body, once washed ashore, is unrecognisable. His jumper, however, identifies the corpse as belonging to one particular family, who can then claim and bury his body. Many people in Ireland know that the story is indeed just that, and yet the myth persists, embellished and elaborated by tourism and the wool trade, especially across the Atlantic. The myth behind the Aran jumper probably comes from a more recent time, and the words of Irish playwright J.M. Synge, 1871 to 1909, who wrote extensively about the fishing communities of the Aran Islands. In one of his tragedies, Riders to the Sea, Synge describes a moment when a woman identifies her drowned brother from the unmistakable stitches on his woolly socks. In the 1963 book, Aran, Islands of Legend, the myth is further oversewn by author and entrepreneur Pádraig Ó Seochan, who writes with great confidence that the Aran Ganzi has always been an unfailing source of identification of islandmen lost at sea, despite there being little evidence that this was the case. Interestingly, the author of the book also owned Galway Bay Products, who made and exported Aran knitwear. Thanks to Ó Seochan's canny instinct for marketing and the value of a product's heritage, however invented, sales of Aran jumpers and cardigans rocketed. Countries with large Irish emigrant communities couldn't get enough of these ancient sweaters, especially the United States, Canada and Australia. Creating a romantic backstory for the Aran jumper, which was more about repackaging local history and heritage, spoke to a diasporic audience longing to reconnect with their ancestral past, however mythologized that might be. As one Irish historian points out, not only is there no evidence to support the idea that our ancestors knitted special clan stitches, the Aran sweater's tradition is actually relatively new. If it has been handed down the generations at all, it can have been only 2 or 3 generations because, as any time traveller would confirm, if you stepped onto one of the 3 Aran Islands 100 years ago, it is highly unlikely you would encounter locals wearing what we would recognise as Aran sweaters. The phenomenal manufacturing success of the Aran jumper owes more to a late 19th century initiative, the Congested Districts Board, a British government policy with the intention of alleviating poverty in the west and northwest of Ireland. It was part of an approach clumsily described by the Chief Secretary for Ireland as killing Home Rule with kindness, though Irish nationalists took a rather different view. Local women were encouraged to pick up their needles and knit furiously. Fishing and sheep farming were already well established on Aran, but times were hard, so making a sideways step into knitting fishermen's ganzis with local materials seemed a crafty move. The Aran jumper, as a symbol of Irish kinship and heritage, clearly struck a chord. During the 1950s and 1960s, it became the go-to uniform for the Irish folk music scene, sported by such much-loved singers such as Tommy Makem and the Clancy Brothers. Even Hollywood came calling. When Grace Kelly, Marilyn Monroe and Steve McQueen pulled on their cream pullovers, it elevated the Aran jumper from icon of rural Irish life to covetable item of knitwear that spoke of home, heart and heritage. What's perhaps less well known is that Aran jumpers also became linked to the scandal of the Magdalen laundries, institutions for fallen women who included single mothers, abused girls and orphans. Such was the success of the Aran jumper in the early 20th century that some of the work was outsourced to the laundries to be carried out by an impoverished, exploited workforce. It's one of history's cruel ironies that Aran jumpers, which represented all that was wholesome and deep-rooted about Irish kinship and domestic life, were sometimes made by women who had been separated from their own families or had their own children forcibly removed. Incredibly, the laundries, which were operated by Roman Catholic orders from the mid-1700s onwards, only closed in the late 20th century amid media revelations of sexual, psychological and physical abuse. Reinventing a past through the story of wool isn't confined to Aran jumpers. Interestingly, almost the same scenario exists with the Icelandic sweater, a garment that is often presented as being traditional and authentically ancient, lovingly handcrafted by local women from the wool of native sheep and following centuries-old patterns. In reality, The sweater's popularity seems to be closely linked to periods in modern history when Iceland needed to reassert its sense of identity and national self-confidence. While knitting has been in Iceland for at least 400 years, the iconic sweater, or lopapeysa, seems to have emerged in the mid-20th century and coincided with the time when factory-made clothes and imported goods were starting to displace older hand-knitted textiles. In the same way that William Morris and the arts and crafts movement in Britain tried to recapture the spirit of handcrafted artisan objects at the end of the 19th century, Icelanders began to search for ways to reignite traditional knitting skills using local wool. It also coincided with an important political moment for Iceland, when the island finally severed all ties with Denmark and declared itself an independent republic in 1944. Icelanders, keen to nation-build and reconstruct traditional values, needed a symbol of cultural heritage. The lopapeysa, lopa means wool and peysa sweater, embodied everything Iceland wanted to be: moderate, industrious, and self-sufficient. The knitting patterns of the lopapeysa, far from being handed down from generation to generation, were a glorious hodgepodge of genuine early Icelandic textile patterns, newly invented designs, and styles copied from other Nordic countries and further afield. It's interesting to note that the lopapeysa enjoyed a second wave of popularity after the 2008 banking collapse, when once again Iceland had to return to its roots. Textile historian Kathleen Donlan notes in her exploration of Icelandic national identity, knitting provided Icelanders, literally and metaphorically, an opportunity to take the difficult times into their own hands and produce something of value. Invention of tradition is an idea that was first put forward by British historians Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger in their 1983 book of the same name. In it, they argue that many of the grand traditions that cultures love to celebrate are often surprisingly recent. What's more, these traditions are often invented to help bolster feelings of national identity or belonging. At times of crisis, migration, or sweeping change, the desire to hold on to and reinforce these traditions becomes ever stronger. Perhaps nowhere is this better expressed than in the invention of ancient Scottish clan tartans. Tartan, without question, has become one of the most evocative, potent symbols of Scotland and its heritage. And yet the history of this woolen cloth is a tangle of genuine antiquity and extraordinary barefaced fabrication. Fact, half-truths and fiction have become interwoven. But to unpick the threads, we must first go back to tartan's very beginnings. The earliest piece of tartan found in Scotland is astonishingly old. Around 1,700 years old, in fact. The Falkirk tartan, in the National Museum of Scotland, at first glance appears unremarkable. Just a small 2.7-inch, 7-centimetre scrap of fabric used as a makeshift stopper on a pot. The jar contained nearly 2,000 Roman coins, but it didn't belong to a Roman. Archaeologists decided that the cash was probably a bribe made to a local Celtic leader on the promise that his tribe wouldn't attack the Roman army as it retreated south, tail between its legs. Tartan had been worn for thousands of years by the Celts, not just in Scotland, but across Europe and Scandinavia. In fact, the oldest example of tartan ever found was discovered in Western China on the mummified remains of a European, who was clearly very far from home, and died around 1000 BC. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing sometime around 50 BC, makes a note of Celtic dress sense.
The clothing they wear is striking. Shirts which have been dyed and embroidered in varied colours, and breeches which they call in their tongue brachai. And they wear striped coats, fastened by a buckle on the shoulder, heavy for winter wear and light for summer, in which are set checks, close together and of varied hues.
Romans also spoke of local tribes wearing tartan-like fabric, but even then there was no indication that particular patterns linked to particular groups. Designs and the colours they used from this time right through to the introduction of exotic dyes in the 18th century would have been based on what was available locally, such as native lichens, heather or tree bark. Certain patterns may have been linked to particular weavers in an area, but it wasn't uncommon for Highlanders to mix and match tartan patterns, even in the same outfit. The Falkirk tartan, for example, only has 2 colours, brown and white, both natural shades of the native sheep. A tartan pattern, therefore, may have been linked to a particular weaver who supplied a specific region or set of families within a locality, but there was no definite association between clan and tartan pattern. One of the earliest mentions of the word tartan dates from 1538, when King James V purchased 3 ells of Highland tartans for his wife. Tartans by that time had become loosely associated with Highlanders, Gaelic-speaking Celtic descendants who had settled in the north of Scotland and become both feared and revered for their fighting prowess. An early woodcut from the 1630s shows Highland mercenaries clearly wearing tartan. Not kilts, however, but the phillimore or great kilt, a long wide length of woolen cloth that wrapped around the body rather like an Indian sari. Following the Glorious Revolution of 1688-9, many of the Highland clans supported the Jacobite cause, which sought to restore the deposed Catholic James II of England and James VII of Scotland and his Stuart descendants to the thrones of both Scotland and England. James II's grandson, Charles Edward Stuart, or Bonnie Prince Charlie, rallied support from some of the Highland clans, but at the Battle of Culloden on the 16th of April 1746, the Jacobites were crushed by English and Scottish forces loyal to King George II. Defeat took little more than an hour. The wearing of tartan, which had been such a symbol of Highland rebellion, was immediately outlawed by the English government. The ban only applied to common Highland men, however. Key supporters of the English cause, including Highland regiments who had fought against the Jacobites and the upper strata of society, retained the right to wear tartan. The law was not only discriminatory, but also peculiarly indiscriminate.
There had been many combatant Lowland Jacobites. There had even been some English Jacobites in arms, but only the Scots Highlander was singled out for this calculated humiliation. The majority of clansmen had actually either kept out of the conflict or had remained loyal to King George. Even so, the Mackays, the Grants, the Campbells, the Munros, and all the other clans whose fathers, sons, brothers and husbands had fought and died for King George were to be mortified in the same way.
The tartan ban was eventually lifted in 1782. In the decades that followed, there was a resurgence of Scottish nationalism, and efforts to restore the spirit and culture of the Highlands were renewed, despite the fact that, at the same time, many of the Highland clans were being displaced by the clearances. In 1822, King George IV visited Edinburgh, the first monarch to do so in over 100 years. English-Scottish relations were still raw from the Jacobite rebellion, but some reconciliation came in the unlikely form of Walter Scott, romantic poet and author of fictionalised histories of Scotland in such novels as Rob Roy and The Bride of Lammermoor. Scott stage-managed the occasion, turning a dryly formal royal visit into a joyous tartan fest, a celebration of Scottish identity, Highland culture and national unity. Dress code for the occasion was clear.
Gentlemen may appear in any uniform to which they have a right, and for those who present themselves as Highlanders, the ancient costume of their country is always sufficient dress. It is understood that Glengarry, Breadalbane, Huntly and several other chieftains mean to attend the levee with their tail on, i.e. with a considerable attendance of their gentlemen followers, and without doubt this will add very greatly to the variety, gracefulness and appropriate splendour of the scene.
King George IV, never one to miss an opportunity to dress up, also slipped into his own little tartan number. A kilt that was so short it needed a pair of salmon pink tights to spare his blushes. Scott's PR exercise worked. Tartan, once the woolen cloth of the rebellious Highlanders, had been tamed and turned into the national dress of the new Scotland. The idea of there being particular clan tartans, however, still hadn't taken hold. The Highland regiments had their own designs, and a handful of Scottish families had formed links with a particular pattern or designed their own. But there was no definitive guide. In the same year as George IV's visit to Scotland, 2 brothers emerged into high society. John Sobieski Stuart and Charles Edward Stuart purported to be the grandsons of Bonnie Prince Charlie, They had, they claimed, discovered a 15th century manuscript, Vestiarium Scoticum, or Scottish clothing, which contained the designs and patterns of all the official clan tartans, lost in time but thankfully rediscovered by the authors. In 1829 they tried to publish it in book form, but got cold feet when Walter Scott asked to see the original 15th century manuscript. Scott died in 1832, and 10 years later the brothers finally published Vestiarium Scoticum in all its magnificent leather-bound glory. It was an instant hit. Society took the young men to their heart, eager to discover the traditional tartans of their forefathers. As one society lady remembers, her sons were handsome men, particularly John Sobieski, who, however, had not a trace of the Stuart in his far finer face. They always wore the Highland dress, kilt and belted plaid, and looked melancholy and spoke at times mysteriously. The effect they produced was astonishing. They were fated to their heart's content. The authors and the book, in time, were revealed to be phony. Walter Scott had been right to doubt its authenticity back in 1829. Writing to a colleague, he not only expressed his view that he didn't believe in the legitimacy of the book, but he also didn't subscribe to the entire concept, claiming, "The idea of distinguishing the clans by their tartans is but a fashion of modern date." John Sobieski Stuart and Charles Edward Stuart were exposed as John and Charles Allen, not royal descendants from the Stuart household, but two young men from Wales with fertile imaginations. It didn't seem to matter, however. The notion of clan tartans had got under high society's skin. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert famously decked out the newly restored Balmoral Castle in wall-to-wall tartan, from curtains to carpets, dresses to children's outfits. The fashionable royal couple were so enamoured with Scotland and its symbolic fabric that they even created their own design, the Balmoral tartan. As for the Allen brothers, they returned to London in 1868. Poverty-stricken and disgraced, they continued to keep up their pretence, spending hours in the British Museum reading room, attempting to establish their legitimacy. They spent so long in the library, it's said they even had a table reserved especially for their use, where they would spend hours scribbling away with pens surmounted with miniature coronets in gold. Chapter 13. Mills and Boom. White Slavery, Wool-Lined Coffins, and La Maladie de Bradford. Anyone idly flicking through the pages of the September issue of Cosmopolitan magazine in 1906 might have stumbled upon one particular story. It described a recent visit to New York made by an old Native American chieftain. On his tour, he was shown all the glorious sights of the city. The skyscrapers, Brooklyn Bridge, the vast shopping emporium selling everything a person could desire. At the end of his journey, he was enthusiastically asked, "What is the most surprising thing you have seen?" The chieftain thought for a moment and replied slowly, "Little children working." And yet child labour had been the fuel that powered the Industrial Revolution, and the textile industry in particular, on both sides of the Atlantic for at least 150 years. But to understand how we got there, we first have to go back to the late 1400s. English exports in raw wool had reached dizzying heights during the late 13th and 14th centuries. By the end of the 1400s, however, successive taxes on the wool industry, levied to fund the wars with France, had unintentionally forced England to develop its own hand-woven cloth market. Rather than send English wool abroad to be woven into cloth, which the country then bought back at a greatly inflated price, wool merchants and entrepreneurs realised they could make their own and sell it both in England and abroad. This burgeoning cloth industry was given a further boost by an influx of highly skilled Flemish cloth weavers. First in the 14th century by royal invitation. Edward III hoped the Flemish weavers could show English crafters how it was really done, and again during the 16th century, when Flemish Protestants fled religious persecution. Those who came settled in various regions across the country. Many landed and stayed in Norfolk and Suffolk, while others ventured further, ending up in the Cotswolds, the West Country, Yorkshire and beyond. In 1454, Parliament had declared that the making of cloth within all parts of the realm is the greatest occupation and living of the poor commons of this land. While nearly 300 years later, Daniel Defoe gushed, "Be their country hot or cold, torrid or frigid, 'tis the same thing, near the equinox or near the pole, the English woolen manufacturer clothes them all." Monarchs passed numerous laws to prop up the English woolen cloth market and compel its subjects to wear homegrown textiles. The Cappers Act of 1571 stated that most people must wear, on Sundays and holidays, a cap of wool thicked and dressed in England, upon pain of forfeit for every day not wearing 3 shillings and 4pence, while in 1697 it was decreed that all magistrates, judges, undergraduates and law professors had to wear woolen gowns. Only a few years earlier, various burial in wool acts made between 1666 and 1680 stated that every person must be buried in an English woolen shroud, unless the deceased had been destitute or had died as a result of the plague. It was decreed that no corpse should be buried in anything other than what is made of sheep's wool only, or put into any coffin lined or faced with any material but sheep's wool on pain of forfeiture of £5. The galloping demand for English cloth was satisfied during this time by independent workers and their families in a production system known as putting out. Cloth merchants would supply wool to a wide network of home-based outworkers who would then transform the yarn into finished textiles. Some outworkers spun, others wove, others dyed, others finished the fabric, and so on. The cloth merchants would then travel round collecting the semi-finished or finished products and either pass them on to the next person in the process or take the finished lengths to sell at one of the many cloth halls across the country. The system may have been domestic, but the scale of trade was enormous and was reflected in the grand architecture of many of the cloth halls. One stands out above them all: Halifax Peace Hall in West Yorkshire. Built between 1775 and 1779, the hall was erected for the express purpose of trading pieces of woolen cloth. A piece was a length of cloth 30 yards or 27.4 metres long. It's an architectural wonder, a dramatic 3-tiered wedding cake of Italianate galleries overlooking a vast 6,000 square metre open-air plaza. Traders would strike deals in the individual rooms set around the quadrangle while being able to overlook the thrum of the crowds below. During the 1700s, Halifax was full of hand weavers. In the 1720s, Defoe scribbled down his impressions as he walked through the town. "We saw houses full of lusty fellows, some at the dye vat, some dressing the cloths, some in the loom, all hard at work and full employed. The women and children always busy carding or spinning, so that all can gain their bread, even from the youngest to the ancient." But cloth traders were frustrated by a lack of anywhere decent to buy and sell their wares, often resorting to selling their bolts of fabric on trestles laid out along the town's roads. Much of the money for the new cloth hall came from the pockets of the merchants themselves, who were keen to have a central place where buyers and sellers could meet and trade during fixed hours, away from the dirt and undesirables of the open streets. The opening ceremony was, by all accounts, a day to remember. A large crowd gathered to watch a grand procession of local clothiers, headed by a noisy marching band, stride into the hall, followed by a spectacular pyrotechnic display. With all the pomp Yorkshire money could muster, the fireworks consisted of a beautiful Egyptian pyramid illumined with spiral wheels, globes and vertical wheels to be set on fire by a pigeon. Halifax also had another claim to fame. The Halifax gibbet was the only guillotine in England. Thought to have been installed during the 16th century, it was used to execute petty thieves on market days, especially those who stole woolen cloth. Even before the days of the Peace Hall, Halifax had become well known for producing a fabric known as kersey, a tough but inexpensive woolen cloth used for military uniforms. During its manufacture, the cloth would be hung outside to dry on frames. Unattended cloth was liable to get stolen, and so punishments were designed to be punitively harsh. Again, Defoe has something to add from his Halifax visit.
I must not quit Halifax till I give you some account of the famous course of justice anciently executed here, to prevent the stealing of cloth. Modern accounts pretend to say it was for all sorts of felons, but I am well assured it was first erected purely, or at least principally, for such thieves as were apprehended stealing cloth from the tenters.
Halifax's reputation for zero tolerance was well known. One poem, The Beggar's Litany by John Taylor, 1622, famously includes the line,
"From hell, Hull and Halifax, good Lord deliver us."
Hull was also famous for its harsh law enforcers. The poem continues,
"At Halifax the law so sharp doth deal, that whoso more than 13 pence doth steal, they have a gin,
engine,
that wondrous quick and well sends thieves all headless unto heaven or hell."
The last execution using the Halifax gibbet took place on the 17th of April, 1650. 2 men, Anthony Mitchell and John Wilkinson, were found guilty of stealing 16 yards, 14.6 metres, of russet-coloured kersey from tenter frames, along with 2 horses, a haul worth a total of £5 8 about £1,000 in today's money. Traditionally, cloth stealers were made to sit in the town stocks until the day of their execution on the following Saturday, with the cloth draped around their shoulders to add to their humiliation. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, Mitchell and Wilkinson were found guilty on a Saturday, and so were executed the same day. Back in the weavers' cottages, many of the people involved in the putting out system were also part-time subsistence farmers, growing food for their families. The putting out system suited merchants, as most of their labour force was rural, cheap, and outside the control of the urban guilds, who would try to protect wages, apprenticeships, and quality control. But the system suited rural families as well, since it often allowed them to supplement other income streams, especially over the winter months, and to work from home with their children. It also gave them a degree of flexibility over the pattern of their working day. As with all piecework carried out at home, however, the control lay ultimately with the merchant, who didn't have to bear the cost of renting the premises, training, lighting, or heating. While some weavers owned their own looms and saw themselves as independent artisans, others had to rent their machinery, and many a dispute arose when merchants refused to pay for finished cloth or collected more in loom rent than the weaving family had earned that week. Lack of representation by any form of guild or labour union left outworkers especially vulnerable, but with few other options available to them, wool workers made up the largest manufacturing sector in the British economy by the middle of the 18th century. Out of a population of around 6 million people, a quarter worked in wool textiles. 3 dominant areas of production, the West Country, East Anglia and West Yorkshire, had already started to emerge. But, in the words of one historian,
there was probably no county of England and Wales in which woolen cloth was not produced by the part-time work of peasants, farmers and agricultural labourers.
There were 2 broad categories of woolen cloth being made in Britain at the time: broadcloth and worsted. Broadcloth was made from short wool fibres, which were carded, using paddles that looked a bit like dog brushes, spun, and then woven on a wide loom. The cloth was then fulled, a process that involved scouring, followed by pounding, which created a bulkier, soft-felted fabric. These broadcloths were used for winter overcoats, blankets, uniforms, anything which needed to be warm and cosy. Worsted cloth was made in a different way, using long-fibred wool, which would be combed to encourage the fibres to lie parallel to each other, oiled, spun with a high level of twist, and then woven into a lighter, finer, shinier fabric, perfect for men's suits, trousers, and furnishing fabrics. Within both of these categories, there were dozens of variations and regional specialities with wonderful names: Bays, Serge, Cheviot, Melton, Fearnought, and Petersham, to name but a handful. By the end of the 1700s, the textile industry was beginning to change dramatically. Thomas Loam's silk mill in Derby, built in 1721, is regarded as the world's first serious attempt at a mechanised textile factory, and heralded a century of innovations that were to alter the face of the industry. Major innovations including John Kay's flying shuttle, 1733, James Hargreaves' spinning jenny, 1764, Richard Arkwright's water frame, 1769, and Samuel Crompton's spinning mule, 1779, revolutionised the way that both wool and cotton could be prepared, spun, and woven. Many of the machines were too big or expensive for individual weaving families to purchase. Some of the larger machines also needed water power to operate. The solution was to create purpose-built textile factories, large enough to house multiple machines, and situate them next to fast-flowing rivers, whose energy helped power large water wheels and provided convenient transport links. The locations of the mills, however, were often remote and the locally available workforce small in number. The solution was a shocking one. Thrusting entrepreneurs, backed by government, were encouraged to recruit the most vulnerable people in society, orphans and destitute children, and turn them into what have been dubbed the white slaves of England. There were plenty of precedents. Between 1619 and 1622, 300 street children from London were sent to work in Virginia's tobacco plantations, where conditions were so harsh that only 12 of them were still alive in 1624. And in 1630, the City of London had been asked to send over 100 friendless boys and girls to work in the new colony's spinning factories. Between the 1650s and the 1680s, thousands of destitute, orphaned or imprisoned children are thought to have been spirited away by traffickers to work in America's newly emerging economy. More often than not, poor children and teenagers were signed away by their own destitute families or tricked into signing themselves up as indentured servants who, when they arrived on faraway shores, were bought, sold, and even gambled away. The captain of one ship, which regularly travelled between London and Jamaica, would visit the Clerkenwell House of Correction, ply with drink the girls who had been imprisoned there as disorderly, and invite them to go to the West Indies. In 1796, Britain's then Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger gave a stirring speech to industrialists, promoting the benefits of child labour. Experience has already shown how much can be done by the industry of children, and the advantage of early employing them in such branches of manufacture as they were capable to execute. The parentless and abandoned were swept up into parish apprenticeships. Children as young as 6 were taken from the overflowing workhouses and orphanages in towns and cities, including London, and packed off to remote corners of the British countryside to work in the new textile mills. As one writer, born in 1823, recalled of his impoverished childhood, "Very early in the last century there was an urgent need for children to work in the factories they were building then on all the streams they could find fit for their purpose in the West Riding of Yorkshire. The local supply of help could not begin to meet the demand, and so the owners of the factories went or sent south to scour the asylums where children were to be found in swarms, to bring them north and set them to work as apprentices." Many of the children didn't know what they were going to, or were duped with promises of a life of fresh air, plentiful food and an education. John Burley, an orphan living in Bethnal Green's workhouse, remembered, "The same year my mother died, I being between 6 and 7 years of age, there came a man looking for a number of parish apprentices. We were all ordered to come into the boardroom, about 40 of us. There were, I dare say, about 20 gentlemen seated at a table, with pens and paper before them. Our names were called out one by one. We were all standing before them in a row. My name was called, and I stepped out in the middle of the room. The man said, 'Well, John, you are a fine lad. Would you like to go into the country?' We had often talked over amongst ourselves how we should like to be taken into the country. Mr. Nichols, the old master, used to tell us what fine sport we should have amongst the hills, what time we should have for play and pleasure. He said we should have plenty of roast beef, and get plenty of money, and come back gentlemen to see our friends." In return for meagre food and board, children were expected to work 14 to 17-hour days, 6 days a week, until they reached the age of 21, or 24 in some cases. John Burley worked from 5 in the morning until 10 at night, ate 2 of his 3 small rations standing up at the machinery, and at night was locked in a room with the rest of the boys, 3 to a bed. Needless to say, dreams of roast beef and plenty of money were hopelessly crushed.
Mr. Needham, the master, had 5 sons, Frank, Charles, Samuel, Robert and John. The sons and a man named Swan, the overlooker, used to go up and down the mill with hazel sticks. Frank once beat me till he frightened himself. He thought he had killed me.
As social historian and child labour expert Professor Jane Humphreys notes, these were the real-life Oliver Twists, left to the mercy of the parishes. Their employment was nothing less than state-sponsored slavery. Work became a substitute for social welfare. Employing children made financial sense. Factory owners and overseers didn't want to employ adults who would demand higher wages and less regimented ways of working. Children could be moulded and coerced. Not only that, but many of the machines were deliberately designed to be operated by young children, with their tiny hands, slight bodies and quick reflexes. Children were often piecers or piecers, mending broken threads, bobbin threaders or scavengers who crawled beneath the machinery and cleaned it. Alongside the regular beatings from overseers, growth-stunting work and noxious fibre fragments clogging up tiny lungs, accidents were commonplace, especially as tiredness set in. One child worker, John Allett, who was interviewed by the House of Commons Committee in 1832, recalled, "I was an eyewitness of one. A child was working wool, that is, to prepare the wool for the machine, but the strap caught him as he was hardly awake and it carried him into the machinery, and we found one limb in one place, one in another, and he was cut to bits. His whole body went in and was mangled." Another boy, Joseph Hebegam, interviewed at the same time, described how he had started working 14.5-hour days at the age of 7 and that the work had left his legs permanently deformed.
In the morning, I could scarcely walk, and my brother and sister used, out of kindness, to take me under each arm and run with me to the mill, and my legs dragged on the ground. In consequence of the pain, I could not walk.
Heartbreaking testimony after heartbreaking testimony reveals small voices from the mills that churned out wool and cotton for a hungry market. And while parish apprentices filled the labour gap for the first few decades of textile mechanisation, children from poor families out in the community soon found themselves also being sent to the deafening mills. Children had always been employed, of course, in a variety of capacities. For centuries, sons and daughters had been expected to help with housework, agricultural chores, and, if possible, find paid work out of the house. In the words of one historian, child labour had a very long taproot in Britain. The difference now, thanks to the wool and cotton industries, was the scale on which they were put to work. The pre-industrial economy, especially in rural areas, wasn't really set up to give families the opportunity to regularly and consistently earn money from their children. But that all changed with the coming of an era of mass-manufactured textiles, when early industrial Britain was a booming economy with an insatiable appetite for strong backs and nimble fingers. Although many saw child labour as a natural part of the working-class experience, not everyone condoned it. Some of the most probing and influential works of Georgian and Victorian literature focused on the topic of child labour. Spurred on by parliamentary inquiries into the conditions at textile mills, mines and other factories, authors such as Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Charles Kingsley, Elizabeth Gaskell, and perhaps most famously Charles Dickens, took up the plight of society's most vulnerable. David Copperfield, Dickens's 8th novel, published in 1850, is based in part on Dickens's own experiences of working in a boot-blacking factory at the age of 12. These and other works exposed the middle-class reader to the horrors of child labour and gave traction to the few campaigners who were fighting for reform. Change was slow, frustrated in part by the many members of Parliament and society who had interests in cloth manufacture. Some voiced their concerns that if children didn't work, their fate would be even worse. The Irish writer, William Cook Taylor, an opponent of anti-child labour legislation, insisted,
"Persons enter a mill. They see the figures of the little pieces and cleaners employed in their monotonous routine, and they think how much more delightful would have been the gambol of free limbs on the hillside, the inhaling of the fresh breeze, the sight of the green mead, with its spangles of buttercups and daisies, the song of the bird and the humming of the bee. But they should compare the aspect of the youthful operatives with other sights which they must have met in the course of their experience, as we too often have in ours. We have seen children perishing from sheer hunger in the mud hovel or in the ditch by the wayside."
Others simply failed to believe there was a problem. Andrew Ure, a Scottish doctor who was a passionate supporter of the factory system, penned this astonishing description in the first half of the 19th century.
"I have visited many factories, both in Manchester and in the surrounding districts, during a period of several months, entering the spinning rooms, and I never saw a single instance of corporal chastisement inflicted on a child, nor indeed did I ever see children in ill humour. They seemed to be always cheerful and alert, taking pleasure in the light play of their muscles, enjoying the mobility natural to their age. The scene of industry, so far from exciting sad emotions in my mind, was always exhilarating. It was delightful to observe the nimbleness with which they pieced the broken ends as the mule carriage began to recede from the fixed roller beam, and to see them at leisure, after a few seconds' exercise of their tiny fingers, to amuse themselves in any attitude they chose, till the stretch and winding on were once more completed. The work of these lively elves seemed to resemble a sport, in which habit gave them a pleasing dexterity."
While Dr. Ure saw lively elves, others thankfully didn't, and the campaign against child labour resulted in the first of many acts designed to limit children's working hours. The Factory Act of 1833 banned children under 9 from working in textiles and limited the hours for those aged between 9 and 13, although in reality enforcement was difficult. Nearly 30 years after the Factory Act, half of all of England's children between the ages of 5 and 15 were still classed as working. Across the water in American mills, change was also piecemeal. Opponents of child labour tried to pass various pieces of legislation during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but often came up against opposition. Most business, church and government organisations were fervently anti-regulation, preferring instead to let individual states and mill owners set their own voluntary agreements. The pro-child labour movement also had plenty of advocates who insisted that life in the mill was not only benign for children, but actively positive.
That to most of these unfortunate people, factory life is a distinct improvement over the log cabin, salt pork and peach brandy, white trash and Georgia cracker type of life from which many of them were sifted out when the mills came.
It wasn't until the passing of the Fair Labour Standards Act of 1938 that US law made it illegal for children under 16 to work in manufacturing or mining. It's almost impossible to imagine the pace of change in the woolen industry during the 19th century in particular. At the start of the century, there were around 250,000 hand-loom weavers across Britain. By 1850, it had fallen to 40,000, and by 1860, only 3,000 remained. A well-known folk song called The Weaver and the Factory Maid, collected by A.L. Lloyd and others, captures the shift from home-based hand-weaving to factory work. "Where are the girls, I'll tell you plain? The girls have gone to weave by steam, and if you'd find them, you must rise at dawn and trudge to the mill in the early morn." To state that the wool and cotton industries detonated one way of life and replaced it with another is no exaggeration. Their influence cannot be overstated. When textile mills moved from water power to steam power, it transformed coal mining into a major industry. Wherever coal was plentiful, such as West Yorkshire, mills would spring up close by and workers would flood to them in their thousands. The machines that clattered in textile mills boosted the iron industry. The demand for quick, efficient methods of bringing raw materials to the textile mills and taking away the finished cloth stimulated first the canal system and then the growth of the railways. At the beginning of the 19th century, the population of Great Britain was just over 9 million people. Only 50 years later, it was nearly 16 million. Perhaps no other place embodies this explosion in population and industry more than Bradford. At the end of the 1700s, Bradford was just a small rural market town, nestling at the foothills of the Pennines. It had a population of around 13,000 people and one woolen mill making worsted fabric. By 1850, the population had swollen to over 100,000, with 129 mills. 25 years later, the population had nearly doubled again, and by the end of the century, 350 woolen mills dominated the skyline, churning out 2/3 of Britain's entire wool production. Bradford had become the textile capital of the world. It was a place uniquely suited to factory-based wool production. Bradford had everything going for it: plentiful local supplies of coal and iron ore to make and feed the machinery, quarries with sandstone to construct the factories and housing, soft water for cleaning the wool, piped from nearby dales, a canal that linked it to ports and international markets, and by the middle of the 1840s, a railway. Workers came from all over the country and further beyond, especially Ireland and Germany, hoping to find a job in the wool trade. By the middle of the 1850s, it is estimated that half the workforce had been born outside the city boundaries. The wealth generated by the wool industry turned Bradford into a prosperous architectural gem of a city. Success attracted success. There was clearly money to be made. The Bradford Observer noted in 1836, "The manufacturers are removing to Bradford as fast as they can get accommodated with looms." But what a city of contrasts! While splendid new civic buildings expressed the confidence of a city dubbed Worstedopolis, and wealthy families enjoyed the comfort of large villas and elegant townhouses, only streets away, most of the factory workers endured overcrowded back-to-backs and slum housing. James Burnley, who wrote for the Bradford Observer, commented, "I wonder how many of the well-dressed, well-fed people who daily pass up and down Westgate have really any experience of or seriously consider the wretchedness, the misery and the disease of which the entrance to Silsbridge Lane is the threshold." In 1843, one health commissioner declared Bradford to be the dirtiest, filthiest, worst regulated town in the kingdom, while Georg Wirth, a radical German pamphleteer and good friend of Karl Marx, famously wrote in 1846, "Every other factory town in England is a paradise in comparison to this hole. In Bradford, however, you think you have been lodged with the devil incarnate. If anyone wants to feel how a poor sinner is tormented in purgatory, let him travel to Bradford." Things were bad. Even by the standards of the day, average life expectancy among textile workers was just 18 years of age. Workers and their families had to contend with a multitude of assaults on their health, some more surprising than others. Along with the usual suspects, caused by overcrowding, open sewers and polluted drinking water, working with wool rendered them vulnerable to other diseases. The people who sorted the wool bales when they arrived in the mill seemed to be succumbing to something that became known as the wool sorter's disease, or La Maladie de Bradford. What started as little more than a cough or tightness in the chest ended only days later with a visit from the undertaker. It took until the end of the 19th century and the work of Dr. Friedrich Jurich, whose father, ironically, was a textile merchant who had brought the family over from Germany to Bradford, to figure out that the dark figure on the warehouse stairs was in fact anthrax, brought in with sacks of imported wool. Anthrax and sheep also hold a special place in the history of medicine. As a disease, it has a significant pedigree. Many scholars believe that one of the 10 plagues of Egypt, as told in the story of Exodus, was probably anthrax. In the founding myth of the Israelites, God brings a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses and donkeys and camels, and on your cattle and sheep and goats. By the 19th century, anthrax was rife, especially among sheep and cattle. In France alone, 10% of all sheep died from the disease each year. Knowing that anthrax seemed to affect sheep in particular, the French chemist Louis Pasteur decided to perform his most audacious experiment to date. Most scientists were convinced that anthrax was caused either by spontaneous generation or by sheep being exposed to some outside factor, such as hot weather or toxic plants. Pasteur, however, was convinced that microbes were to blame. In May 1881, in front of an excited public audience, he gathered together 50 sheep. 25 of the sheep he injected with an anthrax vaccine he'd been working on. The other 25, the control group, got nothing. A month after the vaccine, both groups were deliberately infected with anthrax. 2 days after reinfection, the crowd reassembled to see the results. All the sheep who'd been vaccinated were alive and well. Of the control group, all but 3 sickly-looking sheep had already expired. By the end of the day, the last 3 were also dead. The demonstration was a resounding success. Between 1882 and 1893, nearly 4 million French cows and sheep received the anthrax vaccine. The number of livestock dying from the disease plummeted, and the use of Pasteur's vaccine quickly spread to neighbouring countries and beyond. Thanks to sheep, a simple experiment, and Pasteur's dogged research, which built on earlier work by the German microbiologist Robert Koch, scientific notions we now hold as truths, such as germ theory and the effectiveness of vaccination, became mainstream. It was just one of many occasions, as we'll see in the next chapter, when sheep and science made history. Chapter 14. Up, Up and Away. Bad Science, Sex and Sheep in Space. In 1757, the first edition of a very unusual guidebook came out. It was called Harris's List of Covent Garden Ladies. This little black book contained the names, addresses, prices and bedroom specialities of central London's prostitutes, including details of each woman's likes, hobbies, life history and looks. For wealthy men in the 18th century, whether far from home or simply seeking the thrill of illicit sex, prostitutes were a cheap diversion. And while there were few qualms about picking out a lady from Harris's list, one thought would have been at the forefront of any Georgian gentleman's mind: the spectre of a sexually transmitted disease. Sheep intestines have been used as condoms for millennia. Some of the first early adopters of ovine contraception were Roman soldiers who covered their penises with dried, stretched pieces of gut, kept in place with a bit of string. By the 1700s, however, the art of fashioning male contraception from unwanted offal had reached a level of sophistication few could have imagined. Small-scale manufacturers working out of the big cities of Europe had a ready supply of sheep guts from local butchers and abattoirs. The intestines were first soaked and washed in lye, and then scraped smooth with a knife. These were then exposed to sulphuric steam, which softened the tissue, and then re-washed in lye, soap and water. The crudest condoms were just a square of intestine made into a small drawstring bag which fitted loosely over the man's yard and tied with a jaunty ribbon. English manufacturers soon experimented with other, more tailored models, with seductive French names such as Baudruche and Superfine, designed to tickle the imagination and add a little continental je ne sais quoi. These new condoms were shaped over glass penis-shaped moulds of different sizes, making them a snugger fit, and if your budget stretched far enough, you could even ask for the super secure double, one condom fitted inside another for extra protection. Or the scented condom, perfumed for her pleasure with essential oils and spices. The latter no doubt offered a welcome relief from the inevitable pong of unwashed bodies and warm sheep gut. At the end of the 1990s, archaeologists had the rather unusual privilege of being allowed to sift through the remains of a 17th century toilet at Dudley Castle in the West Midlands. The toilet had been used by 300 royalist soldiers who had been garrisoned and then besieged in the castle during the English Civil War. In the process of working their way through 100 cubic feet of human excrement and other waste, the archaeologists discovered the oldest condom found anywhere in the world, a reusable sheep gut dating back to the 1640s. The English Birth Rate Commission in 1666 first uses the word condom, initially spelled condon, hailing it as the reason for a significant fall in the country's birth rate. Most men, however, weren't using condoms for family planning, but rather to protect themselves from the horror of syphilis, a disease that had been romping its way through Europe since the late 1400s. The word syphilis, incidentally, also has a sheepy connection. In 1530, the Italian physician and poet Girolamo Fracastoro wrote a pastoral poem which featured a shepherd boy, Syphilus, who is struck down with the terrible disease by the Greek god Apollo, as a punishment for insulting him. The name stuck. Soldiers and sailors were particularly good at spreading syphilis, often by sleeping with local prostitutes. As the disease seemed to spread from contact with foreigners, nations blamed each other. The English called it the French disease, the Italians called it the Turkish disease, the French called it the Italian disease, and so on. People were horrified by its ghastly disfiguring effects, which are vividly described by the historian Jared Diamond. Its pustules often covered the body from the head to the knees, caused flesh to fall off people's faces, and led to death within a few months. Sheep gut condoms were the only reliable protection against what was, at that time, a deadly, incurable condition. Brothels sold them to clients, and even the world's greatest lover, Casanova, became a convert. At first, the unstoppable Lothario had expressed his dislike for what he called dead animal skin, but soon came around after he realised how effective they were at protecting him from disease. He became adept at testing condoms for leaks by blowing them up with his mouth, and wrote at length about trying to get partners to get on board the notion of what he called a prophylactic against anxiety. 200 years later, in 1988, the UK's Health Education Authority brought out a now iconic poster promoting condoms for use against HIV. The poster featured an array of historic condoms, including one used by Casanova, accompanied by the words, "So if the world's greatest lover made do with sheep gut, surely you can use a condom." Thinking on the notion of blowing up condoms, before Michael Faraday invented the first rubber balloon in 1824, toy balloons and footballs were made from, among other things, sheep offal. Bladders, inflated and then dried, created excellent lightweight balls, while intestines made sausage-shaped balloons not dissimilar to those used by modelers or twisters today. Children's parties must have been a hoot. It was also a balloon, on a much bigger scale, that made sheep history on the 19th of September, 1783. The previous June, brothers Jacques Etienne and Joseph Michel Montgolfier had successfully demonstrated the first ever hot air balloon flight. The balloon, made from fabric and paper and lit from underneath by a straw fire, was unmanned but managed a respectable 10-minute flight before floating back down to earth. King Louis XVI, hearing of the brothers' success, ordered the brothers to bring their invention to Paris and test it in front of the royal palace at Versailles. The king also wanted to see what would happen if you put a human inside the balloon, and suggested the brothers tested it using 2 criminals pulled from the king's prison. The brothers gracefully declined the offer of convict guinea pigs and suggested instead that they first send a sheep, called monte au ciel, meaning reach the sky, a duck, and a cockerel along for the ride. Far from being random test pilots, the brothers thought the combination of animals would provide an interesting experiment. The sheep's physiology was thought to be a close match for the human body, and the duck was chosen as a control as it was used to flying at high altitudes. The cockerel posed an interesting scientific conundrum. What would happen to a bird that wasn't used to flying at high altitudes? The farmyard flight crew lifted off, nearly 1,600 feet, 500 metres into the air. Watched by an open-mouthed crowd of 130,000 people, the King and Marie Antoinette. After a heart-stopping 8-minute, 2-mile, 3.2-kilometre flight, the balloon drifted back down with a surprisingly gentle landing. All 3 passengers were alive. The sheep, duck and cockerel were crowned heroes of the air and, so the legend goes, sent to live out the rest of their days in Louis's royal menagerie. Just 2 months later, Jean-François Pilatre de Rosier and François Laurent Le Vieux d'Arlande made the first human trip in a balloon. Thanks to plucky Montausiel and her foul friends, people could at last leave the surface of the earth and soar to the heavens. The wait for human flight was finally over. The ordeal for sheep, however, wasn't. Now the art of ballooning had been perfected, the next question was how to come back down to earth. Early parachute experiments often involved dropping animals wearing prototype parachutes from hot air balloons. In 1817, Mr. Renault from New Orleans attempted to drop a sheep from his hot air balloon by means of a parachute. No records exist of whether the sheep wafted down safely, although judging by most other parachute tests of the day, things probably didn't go well. Only a few years earlier, a British Army officer, Colonel Thornton, had dropped his dog, who was wearing a parachute, from a hot air balloon in London. According to contemporary sources, the unfortunate canine descended to earth with great velocity before hitting the ground with a crunch. Remarkably, despite sustaining a number of injuries, the dog survived. The Montgolfier brothers weren't far off in their assertion that sheep had a similar physiology to humans. Sheep are bright social creatures whose large body size, long life, and docile nature have made them an attractive testing ground for scientists through the ages. In 1667, for example, the French physician Jean-Baptiste Denis performed the first fully documented human blood transfusion using lamb's blood. The patient was a sickly 15-year-old boy who had been suffering from blood loss, thanks to overzealous leeching by a previous doctor. Denis managed to get about 12 fluid ounces, 341 mils, of lamb's blood into the boy, and miraculously he lived. Emboldened, Denis repeated the experiment on a labourer who also survived the procedure. We now know that human-animal transfusions are deadly. Denis' 2 patients probably survived only because of the small amounts of blood involved. But he wasn't so lucky with his 3rd patient, a madman called Antoine Mauroy, who died during his 3rd transfusion. Denis was accused of murder by Mauroy's wife and, although eventually acquitted, was put off practicing medicine for the rest of his life. It wasn't until 1902 and Karl Landsteiner's groundbreaking discovery of the 4 different blood groups and their incompatibility that blood transfusions became a safe and common hospital procedure. Sheep have been at the centre of some historic scientific and medical breakthroughs, from womb transplants to growing new heart valves, but the most famous is, of course, Dolly the sheep. Dolly was the first mammal to be cloned from an adult cell. In 1996, scientists at the Roslin Institute, Scotland, used cells from the mammary gland of a 6-year-old Finnish Dorset sheep to create Dolly. The experiment proved that specialised cells could be used to create an exact copy of the sheep they came from. In fact, Dolly wasn't the first ever cloned animal. That honour goes to Megan and Morag, 2 sheep that had been cloned from embryonic cells at Roslin a year earlier. Dolly went on to live to the age of 6.5, gave birth to 6 healthy non-clone lambs, and after her death, her body was donated to the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, where she has become the star attraction. A less well-known but equally gripping scientific breakthrough also has sheep at the centre of its story. In 1958, a man with a strong Eastern European accent strolled into the Animal Sciences Department at the University of Sydney. He announced himself to be Dr. Stephen Salomon and explained that he knew how to artificially breed livestock, a scientific skill yet to be cracked by the West. Would the department, he asked, give him a job? As a young man, Salomon had served in the Hungarian army and fought alongside the Germans in the Second World War. But at the end of the war, he was captured by the Soviets and sent to a prison camp in Siberia. There he stayed for 3 hellish years, narrowly surviving death. At one point, Salomon had been thrown into a frozen pit by the guards, but managed to survive by covering himself with the dead bodies and clothes of other people who had suffered the same fate. After the war, Salomon qualified as an animal scientist, but he wanted to live somewhere as far removed from the icy gulag as possible and came to Australia. From the early 1960s, Salomon led experiments in artificial insemination in sheep flocks and developing methods of freezing and storing semen. His groundbreaking work not only changed the face of modern sheep farming, but ultimately inspired research into human IVF. After his death in 2017, at the ripe old age of 98, his former colleagues decided to defrost some of the ram semen Dr. Salomon had frozen back in 1968. The sperm was now the best part of 50 years old, and surely far too long in the freezer to still be useful. The semen was inserted into merino ewes, and to everyone's astonishment, the sheep not only got pregnant, but the quality of the frozen sperm was as good as the day it was first produced. This half-century-old sperm set the world record for the oldest semen ever to be used, but, more importantly, showed scientists the potential for long-term conservation of genetic material. The ramifications were profound, from freezing eggs and sperm of patients undergoing long treatment to the preservation of endangered animals. Dr. Salomon's work changed our expectations of what is possible in genetic science. As one Australian journalist noted dryly, a legacy very apt for a man who himself came out of the freezer. The more we find out about sheep, however, the more complex the questions that arise surrounding animal experiments. For thousands of years, sheep have been stereotyped as stupid, unthinking creatures. We couldn't have got it more wrong. One study in 2001 showed that sheep can recognise and remember at least 50 different faces. What's more, they can still recognise these same faces after 2 years. Humans have a specialised neural mechanism for visual recognition, which allows us to differentiate and recall lots of different faces. This is thought to be one of the most important traits needed for social interaction and relationships. Imagine a world where everyone you met was a stranger. It turns out that sheep have similar neural systems in their temporal and frontal lobes and can recognise both humans and other sheep by their faces, even after long periods apart. What's even more incredible is that the same experiment showed that sheep can distinguish between different facial expressions and, as with humans, prefer a smile to a sad face. Another study in Australia looked at how sheep dealt with trying to find their way through a complex maze. The experiment showed that not only did the sheep navigate their way through without too many problems, but that on every subsequent occasion they got faster and faster. What took 2 minutes on the first day took only 30 seconds by the third. And even more astonishing, 6 weeks later, when they were tested again, the sheep remembered their way through and equalled their previous best times. Sometimes fact is stranger than fiction. Back in 2004, the inhabitants of a Pennine Hill village were flummoxed. How were the sheep that grazed on the edge of the village of Marsden getting over a cattle grid to ravage the lawns of local residents? The cattle grids had been installed years ago to keep the sheep on the moorland, but lately they seemed to have taken a fancy to the village's flower beds and front gardens. The grids were too wide to leap and too tricky to tiptoe across, so how were the sheep crossing? Villagers were amazed to discover that the sheep were getting on their backs and rolling across the cattle grids like SAS commandos. Scientists who work with sheep weren't surprised, however. One neuroscientist at the University of Cambridge found that sheep performed at a level similar to monkeys and humans in certain learning tasks. In a recent interview, Professor Jenny Morton explained just how talented sheep are. They've got big brains. I'd challenge someone who wasn't an expert to tell the difference between a monkey brain and a sheep brain. And they are immensely trainable. You can take any old sheep out of a field and in 2 weeks teach it to do a task it might take a monkey 9 months to learn. One of the most interesting recent discoveries, however, is that sheep can be gay. In any flock of domesticated sheep, about 8% of the males seem to prefer the company of other males, even in the presence of fertile females. There are plenty of other examples of homosexuality in the natural world. From female macaques to male fruit flies, many species engage in same-sex behaviour, whether by accident or for pleasure and social bonding. The difference has always been, however, that animals in nature seem to switch between homosexual and heterosexual behaviour. They don't show consistent sexual orientation. only 2 species have ever been seen to show same-sex preference for life, even when partners of the opposite sex are readily available. One is humans, and the other is, surprisingly, domesticated sheep. For a long time, homosexual behaviour was seen as unnatural. On the face of it, it doesn't seem beneficial for the survival of the human species to have same-sex couples who won't be able to pass on their genes to the next generation. And yet what the science of sheep sexuality shows us is that homosexual behaviour doesn't challenge Darwinian ideas but may in fact reinforce them. One idea is that there may be one particular gene that expresses itself in different ways. The same gene that expresses itself as homosexual behaviour in male sheep might be the same gene that increases a female sheep's fertility. The female siblings of gay sheep produce more offspring than average, helping that specific gene to carry on in subsequent generations. In other words, the gene that predisposes some sheep to be homosexual promotes reproductive success in others. Sheep farmers have over the centuries enhanced the effects of this gene by choosing and breeding from females that are the most fertile. So, what's the future for sheep? We're at a crossroads. While in the West, many people are eschewing sheep meat for health and ecological reasons, demand from the developing world is predicted to soar over the next few decades. On one hand, we have a romantic view of sheep farming, the lonely shepherd herding his or her flock on upland farms and maintaining an ancient and important way of life. On the other, we have vast, intensive agribusiness, churning out meat and wool on an industrial scale to feed consumer demand for cheap meat and affordable textiles. Throw in issues such as animal welfare, the health implications of red meat, climate change and biodiversity loss, and you have a situation for sheep farming that's full of contradictions and dilemmas. The future for sheep is uncertain. The planet cannot tolerate a future of overstocking and aggressively intensive farming practices that pay scant attention to the animals' welfare. Soil degradation, water pollution, carbon emissions, deforestation and other environmental headaches are already upon us. The global livestock industry has degraded land, contributed to the greenhouse effect, polluted watercourses, and had a disastrous effect on biodiversity. And if we look at the entire production cycle of sheep farming, either for wool or meat, we see that at every stage of the process, issues arise. Whether it's emissions generated by fertiliser and animal feeds, what to do with endless piles of manure, chopping down trees for pasture land, methane from sheep's digestion, or the carbon cost of transporting sheep and animal feed by vehicle. On the face of it, sheep don't look like a sustainable option. And yet we mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Current methods of intensive vegetable and crop production are hardly an improvement. As the demand for plant-based foods and vegetable fats increases, it is producing equally destructive environmental effects in many parts of the world. Deforestation of rainforests for palm oil, soil degradation, vast use of pesticides and fungicides. Added to this, there are significant concerns surrounding genetically modified soybean cultivation. In the UK, where the pulling up of hedgerows to make large monocultural fields has long been a cause of environmental anxiety, intensive arable farming has decimated pollinator numbers and led to a dramatic decline in wild plant species. It's an interesting time for sheep farming, not least because we'll have to pick our way through different points of view. The solutions will also be highly localised and nuanced. Organisations such as the Sustainable Food Trust and the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change believe that sheep can, if managed properly, be part of the solution. Soil degradation, for example, could be reversed if we return to mixed farming systems which include plenty of pasture and nitrogen-fixing legumes grazed by sheep and cattle. Pasture land, especially if it is sown with long-rooted varieties of grass, also captures and locks away carbon. In some instances, grazing can actually improve biodiversity. In the UK, many of our different landscapes, heathland, coastal marshes, wood pasture and grassland, all rely on a bit of grazing to maintain the variety of plants and wildlife that live there. For some areas, such as upland, animal grazing is often the only economically viable and productive use of land. Crops simply won't grow there. There's also the cultural legacy. For thousands of years, people have lived with, looked after, and built their environments around sheep. Many of the rural traditions and skills that we value in the UK, for example, come from sheep farming and wool production. From dry stone walls to agricultural shows, sheepdog trials to spinning and weaving, the heritage and landscape that we cherish and still enjoy comes in large part from centuries of sheep farming. Like ancient crafts or period buildings, traditional farming allows us to keep a link to our past and helps us understand who we are. We've got to be so careful not to let agriculture become something so technologically efficient and mechanised that we lose touch with the fact that we are dealing with other living creatures and plants. It's heartening to see how many people are re-engaging with the countryside, whether by visiting country shows, reading rural interest magazines, or watching nature programmes on TV. We must somehow, however, join up this deep affection we have for a rural way of life with the choices we make as consumers and the agricultural policies we support at a national level. Our landscape, our wildlife, our towns and villages, our history, our language and our sense of identity all come, in no small part, from the thousands of years we have shared the planet with ewes, lambs and rams. Sheep have changed us as much as we have changed them. You've been listening to A Short History of the World According to Sheep by Sally Coulthard, narrated by Karen Cass. Published by Whole Story Audiobooks, an imprint of W.F. Howes Limited. This work is copyrighted 2020, Sally Coulthard. This recording is copyrighted 2020, Head of Zeus.
Audible hopes you've enjoyed this program.